Now let's work on a more complex scene type, which is a VFX scene that will have backplate, undistorted plate, distorted plate, and lens distortion, fluid, and a lot of instances. And yeah, let's have a look at that. So as we mentioned before, we will create a Katana template for the scene itself first. Then let's just set it to in progress and load dependencies. It's the same concept that we mentioned before. The production manager will load whatever is needed to be loaded and will ignore the rest. And most importantly, that the project Katana template will be loaded, because this is what we urgently need. Notice that we have here some plates. Let's arrange these things. I have this here, and okay, so this is actually the train fluid simulation. And notice that the VDBs, by the way, are coming like a group that has XML that applies the material tags and stuff like this that is needed for the shading and rendering. This happens automatically when we loaded the dependencies, that these are setting the material, for example, to Pyro shader, to the Pyro shader, and the text diar, just like any other objects that it has, because this, as we mentioned before, will use this information to resolve the shaders and the textures needed to be applied on that shader. And here, this is a scene graphics ML, and actually, we provide a custom version of Katana's Scene Graphics ML that supports loading more types in addition to what the default Scene Graphics ML is loading. Actually, we are just adding the Pixar USDN, and we are modifying the way how the Scene Graphics ML is loading Alembic files, because the default one will create a group called geometry that we don't want it, because we want the Alembics loaded from inside this, or the USDs loaded from inside the XML, to have the same hierarchy as if it's loaded from outside it. So we just made this modification on the original source code of the Scene Graphics ML. Anyway, this is a little bit more technical for what we are doing now. So these are what you found here. Is that, let's make it easier by filtering plates. We have a lot of plates here for several shots, so this is only one of them that is loaded based on the currently selected shot. It didn't detect the color range, and also notice that it doesn't find the frame, because we are standing on a frame that doesn't have the picture, so don't worry about this. So we have here an undistorted version of the plate, and we have here the original plate that has distortion. If you watch it, the 3D tracking for this scene, you will understand why do we have the two, and when did we generate them, and we will see later in this session how we are going to use this and why they are actually loaded here. So let's assume that this is for now the template that I want for this, and I will just publish it as it is, because I don't need to do anything with it, because it's more than enough to do the job. But no, actually I will have to switch this to path tracer, because Pixar Unified is not going to support holdout objects. And actually, let's configure the holdout objects. Also, don't worry about the steam. It will be fixed when we go to when we set the shot itself, because shot 1 doesn't have steam. If we switch to shot 2, yeah. And we also want to configure these objects to be, let's actually go to this again. I want these objects to be holdout objects, and also I don't want them to cast shadows. Also, let's set the proper So actually that's why we have to create a scene template, especially in this testing project. Actually, it's usually your project will have only one frame setting spot. For this testing project, I have multiple resolutions, so that is one of the things why I have to have a Katana template for the scene itself. So I don't modify the global project one, but I will modify it just for this scene. Anyway, that on the other hand, here we have, this is the preview. This preview is also is mixing the alpha channel with the shadow pass and during the live render, which will allow you to view the distorted or undistorted layer as an underlay in the monitor here, and to be able to see your render on top of the backplate. Also, notice that one of the dependencies that is loaded here is this NR-TDE lens shader. This is actually is our lens distortion shader for RenderMan and Arnold, which will allow you to render the CG directly with the distortion that matches the distortion that was in the plate directly, without doing any undistort and without doing distorting later for the rendered layers. That in case if you want it. Also, this will automatically be enabled using this node here. So this is actually loaded from, if you go through the dependencies, you will find that the production manager have detected the tracking of the the tracking that we made for the scene. This has lens information that was used for the shots that were defined and tracked in this shot. Anyway, this is beyond the scope of our lighting sessions here, but just remember that the tracking information of the shot is coming here in this lens, and this lens is going to be used to render your CG to match the back plate and to match the distortion of the back plate, as we will see just now. So I think that's all what I need to do to configure this setup here, and we are ready to publish this as a template. So this is an initial version, and let's assume that the supervisor have approved it. I'm just doing that because if I work it without having it approved, the next time it gets approved, it will notify me that all the shots that were affected by it, by the new version, needs revisiting. So I just want to avoid this. So now let's work on a shot that it's the only one that has the assets needed actually. So it's scene 1, shot 2. Notice that it's the only one that is ready to start actually. So when I set this task to current and I will set it to in progress, notice that also the shot frame range has been set automatically, and all what I need to do now is just to load dependencies, and as usual everything will be resolved. Then we want to stop for a while to discuss some things that is happening around here. As we mentioned before, this is the lens distortion. This is the lens distortion. This is the train fluid that you are seeing here. Let's go to this frame. This is the fluid of the train, and this is an Ecosys process. The Ecosys process actually is, if you notice here, you will find this is actually a process of instancing some assets that you can do this in Maya to make Ecosys from assets that you already have in the system, and these will be written into an array instances, array type. And we have also here, this is, as we mentioned before, is the scene graph XML assembled. By the way, we don't support publishing any animation inside this. It's just a container of components or references to Alembics and USDs and like this. We don't use it for any other purpose when we load dependencies. And here, one of the assets we have is this one. And this one actually, just for a stress test to the system, this is actually having about 7 million pebbles is going to traverse and render. So that's enough for now. Let's start testing our render. I will view the shot plate, and yeah, this I think it didn't detect the color space. So let's go, for example, to one frame here, like the monitor becoming small now. Let's maybe render some frame here. Then let's take this and put it on the underlay. And let's look from here. So this is what we should render. Let's double check that we have everything proper. Yes, and here we go. Let's try to render one frame and see. Yeah, now notice I didn't configure any lights. The 3-point light is not gonna work here. Let's take this light for testing. And also let's fix this because the reformat is actually isn't correct. That because of the project settings, actually it's below this one. This means that the Katana template needs to be republished, otherwise we will have to do this on each shot later, but I will not do this now. It's just to let you know what is supposed to happen when we forget something like in this case. So let's now render this frame. Okay. This will take some, maybe around a minute to traverse the scene that, as I mentioned, it has extreme amount of instances. This whole street is full of pebbles, and the railway and the train, and here are some instances of trees. And actually they are configured to be rendered as subdivs, which will also add another layer of complexity. So this is it, as you can see. It's just a roughly built scene with millions of pebbles here. So that's it. Then we will assume that this is what we wanted. This is the here the fluid simulation is as we mentioned before. It's having the same pyro shader, but this time I published a texture for the smoke color. That's why it's looking almost black steam. In addition to that, notice how the rendered CG is perfectly matching the distortion of the blade. And if we look at the undistorted blade in comparison to the distorted one, this is the original plate. This is the undistorted one that we rendered during the 3D tracking process. So our render now is matching to this plate. It's perfectly matching to it. If we try to watch it here, you will notice that there is a very big difference between the two. And of course, if you prefer to use the undistorted method to distort later, then you will have to render using you will have to disable the lens distortion assignment, and you will have to render this without it, which will produce undistorted CG on top of the undistorted plate. And by the way, of course, the render here doesn't have such composite. So this is, as mentioned here, it's just preview only, but the render will have the shadow pass separate. Then we will do the composite of the shadows on the back plate and in comp. And if Seneferu also supports, if the shot have foreground layers like green screen or something, then you can actually they will be loaded automatically like these plates here. Then you can use them as an overlay planes also to as an overlay layers to so you can see a comp for what you are rendering. So I'm just rendering now one frame without the distortion, so we can also compare that. So, and this is in case if we render undistorted CG on the undistorted plate. Just to make a comparison between the two, let's disable actually the overlay. So this is the difference between the two. So this is it, and I will publish render for this one as we did for the previous shots. And let's try this time have a chance to make a snapshot when we publish. Then so here we go. We can now click on publish, And let's take the snapshot. And I will say submit to render. So that's it for the lighting. In the next session, we will see how Seneferu will handle the render layers that we did in Comp in Nuke.